I had been driving along the outskirts of my small town in the early hours of a late October morning, the kind of night where the air feels damp and heavy, and the fields beyond the road seem endless and silent. I was on my way home from a friend's place, taking the long route through back roads I had traveled 100 times before. The fog was thick in patches, hanging low over the cornfields, and my headlights cut thin paths through the gray, illuminating the occasional fence post or telephone pole. Everything was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the town had paused and left me alone with the sound of my tires on the asphalt. I noticed it as I approached a curve that I had never taken before, though I had lived in the area for years. A small road branched off to the right, narrow and lined with trees whose branches met overhead, forming a tunnel-like canopy. It wasn't on my usual maps, and I would have missed it entirely if the fog hadn't highlighted the yellow of the faded road sign. The air smelled damp and earthy, the way it does after early autumn rain, and I felt the familiar pull of curiosity. I slowed the truck, the tires crunching against gravel that had overtaken the asphalt, and followed the turn. The road led to a clearing I didn't recognize, a patch of land with abandoned farmhouses set far apart. One house in particular caught my attention. Its paint was peeling, the roof sagged, and several windows were broken, letting the night air slip into the hollow interior. The yard was overgrown, weeds taller than my knees in some spots, fallen branches scattered across the ground. It looked like it had been empty for years. I parked along the edge of the clearing, leaving the truck running. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cold biting through my jacket. My boots sank slightly into the soft soil, and every movement made the dry leaves crunch loudly in the otherwise silent night. I moved toward the house slowly, taking note of details I had never seen before from the road. The front door was slightly ajar, the frame warped, hinges rusted. I shone my flashlight inside the open doorway. The interior was dark, musty, filled with the smell of rotting wood and dampness. Broken furniture leaned against the walls, tables overturned, chairs scattered, and the remnants of household life. Cups, a few magazines, faded curtains, lay abandoned on the floor. Dust covered everything in a thick layer, disturbed only by footprints in the dirt and debris. The footprints were fresh. They weren't mine or my truck's. They were human-sized, running along the floorboards in a path that led upstairs. I hesitated at the bottom of the staircase, flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand. The steps creaked under my weight, each one groaning as if protesting my presence. I noticed marks along the walls, smudges and scratches at shoulder height, as if someone had moved hurriedly through the hallway. I could hear the faint scuff of something being dragged across the floor above me, deliberate and slow. I froze, listening, trying to identify the sound. It wasn't loud, not like someone was running, but heavy, consistent, and methodical. My heart started pounding, adrenaline rising in response to the uncertainty. I forced myself to step forward, keeping low, scanning the shadows. The upstairs hallway was partially visible from where I stood, the boards warped and bowed in the middle. I shined my flashlight toward the movement. For a moment, nothing appeared. My mind raced through possibilities, a squat, a transient taking shelter, a large animal. But the shape, the consistency of the noise didn't match anything logical. I could sense weight and presence, something occupying space in a way that felt physical, real. The sound stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was oppressive. I felt exposed, aware that anyone or anything upstairs would know I was here. My dog, who had come with me and now stayed near the truck, would have reacted instinctively, growling or bristling, but he wasn't here. This was all on me. Every instinct screamed to leave, and I obeyed. I stepped backward carefully, retreating from the house, scanning the darkened interior one last time before moving toward the edge of the clearing. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint smell of decay and something metallic, a trace that made my skin crawl. I reached the truck, keeping my movements deliberate and slow. I climbed in, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, listening. The night seemed to stretch and contract around me. the silence broken only by the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. I started the engine, headlights cutting through the fog as I backed onto the road. I glanced once at the house. In the beam of the headlights, I thought I saw movement in the upstairs window, a dark shape retreating into the shadows. My pulse quickened, and I pushed the truck forward, turning back onto the main road and keeping my speed steady, not daring to look back. The drive home was tense. I stayed alert, scanning the edges of the road for any sign of another vehicle or figure. Every shadow seemed elongated, every tree a potential hiding place. Hours passed before I felt the tension begin to ease. The town lights eventually appeared, street lights casting a familiar glow over houses and sidewalks. The ordinary calm of the town contrasted sharply with the unease I had carried from the clearing. I parked in my driveway and sat in the truck for a long time, letting the warmth settle in, trying to process what I had experienced. The next day, I returned to the area, driving past the clearing during daylight. The abandoned farmhouse was still there, empty and derelict, but the marks, the footprints, the sense of presence I had felt the night before had disappeared. In daylight, the house seemed inert, ordinary. There was no trace of movement, no clue as to what had occupied it, no explanation for the weight and methodical sounds I had heard. It was simply an old structure in a field, quiet in a way that made my previous experience feel almost surreal. I told no one about the details. There was no evidence, nothing tangible. Even my photographs of the area failed to capture the subtle impression of weight and movement I had sensed. Over time, I accepted that the experience was part observation, part imagination heightened by isolation, darkness, and my awareness of how easily someone could be in an abandoned building without detection. Still, I adjusted the way I traveled at night, avoiding back roads and unknown clearings, keeping to familiar paths where the ordinary, predictable environment reassured me. The memory of that night remained vivid. The feel of gravel under my boots, the scent of damp earth and rot, the creaking steps upstairs, the faint, deliberate sound of movement above me. It was grounded in reality, something that could have been explained by a transient, a trespasser, or an animal, yet the uncertainty of it made it linger in my mind. I understood that small towns have quiet corners, places that appear abandoned but are never truly empty, and that encountering them alone at night carries risk. That night taught me vigilance, awareness, and respect for the ordinary spaces that conceal unexpected activity. The fear wasn't of anything supernatural. It was the fear of presence, of weight, of something real and unseen occupying a place it shouldn't, and the knowledge that I had walked too close, alone, at the wrong time. I parked on the gravel beside the old railroad siding just after midnight, the town behind me silent except for the occasional hum of distant traffic. The siding had been abandoned for decades, the rails rusted and warped, ties rotting under moss and weeds. I had come out to take photos of the stars, hoping to catch the Milky Way stretching across the clear November sky. The air was sharp with the scent of cold earth, damp leaves, and the tang of iron from the rails themselves, a metallic undertone that mixed with the smell of wet soil. The wind was calm, still enough that the trees at the edge of the siding barely stirred, leaving the night quiet, almost oppressive in its stillness. I set my camera on a tripod near the tracks, adjusting the lens toward the stars. The boards beneath my feet creaked faintly, but the sound was almost swallowed by the hush of the night. Every few minutes, I would glance down the siding, past the rails that disappeared into the dark, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed, that the tracks were simply old and abandoned, completely lifeless. The first few shots came easily, long exposures capturing the faint glow of the town lights on the horizon and the scattered pinpoints of stars overhead. Then I heard it, a train whistle, at first distant and weak, barely rising above the quiet. I froze, the sound unfamiliar here. No train had run on these tracks in decades, and I could see the bridge where the rails ended abruptly over the river not far from where I stood. The whistle came again, sharper this time, closer. My pulse quickened. I scanned the rails with my flashlight, a narrow beam cutting through the black. Everything appeared as it had before. Rusted rails, rotting ties, weeds curling through the cracks. Still, the whistle continued, rhythmic and insistent, coming from somewhere down the siding. The sound grew louder, faster. My stomach tightened as I noticed headlights in the distance. Around a bend of the rails I hadn't been able to see from where I stood. The glow was faint at first, nothing more than a pinprick of light, but then it expanded, sharp and blinding as it approached. My mind struggled to process it. The tracks ahead ended in a river, the bridge long washed away by floods years ago. There was no way a train could have come down this siding. No way the rails could carry anything heavier than my camera tripod. I stepped back, my boots scraping gravel. The sound of the train, a low rumble, the screech of metal against rust, grew closer, surrounding me, filling the night. The whistle blew again, a long, keening note that pressed into my chest, vibrating in my bones. I started to run, heart pounding, adrenaline pushing me over the uneven gravel. My camera tripod tipped over behind me, legs snapping against the ground, but I didn't stop. The headlights grew brighter, cutting through the darkness, yet when I glanced back, there was nothing. No train, no rails moving, no bridge to carry anything over the river. Only the siding, old and broken, and the black water beyond it. Still, the noise followed me, the distant rumble pressing against my ears, the whistle lingering, impossible to locate. I stumbled over roots and rocks, hands gripping the hood of my car as I finally reached it. The gravel crunched sharply beneath my boots, and I could feel the sweat running down my back despite the cold night air. I locked the doors and sat there for a long moment, hands trembling, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. The headlights were gone. The siding was silent again, empty except for the rusted rails and the faint reflection of the stars in the river. My chest heaved, my fingers cold despite the warmth of the car. And yet, the whistle persisted, faint now, like a sound embedded in the air itself, carried just beyond reason. I could still hear it as I drove away, the notes stretching, dipping, lingering in my mind, echoing long after the gravel and rust had disappeared behind me. The ride home was slow, every shadow along the narrow roads making me flinch, every tree on the side of the road seeming to stretch a hand out. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting headlights, expecting the rails to appear beside the road, expecting some impossible continuation of what I had seen. But nothing appeared, only the faint, lingering echo of the whistle, ringing in my ears, the kind of sound that presses against memory and refuses to leave. At home, I checked the footage on my camera, hoping for some explanation, something to ground the night in reality. The stars were captured perfectly. The rails were empty. There was no evidence of a train, no movement, no anomaly to explain the whistle or the headlights. Only the photos themselves, perfectly ordinary, untouched by any supernatural occurrence, left me with nothing tangible except my memory and the feeling of something impossible pressing against the edges of logic. I tried to rationalize it for days. Perhaps it had been a train horn carried from the distant main line, warped by the wind to seem impossibly close. Perhaps it had been my mind, exhausted and alone, creating the illusion of movement and sound. Every logical explanation seemed plausible, yet insufficient. There was an insistence to the memory, a weight to the sound that refused dismissal. The whistle was precise, deliberate, and entirely real in a way that left no room for hallucination. Weeks later, I drove past the siding again in daylight to see it in its ordinary state. The rails were still rusted, broken, ending abruptly over the river. No movement, no sound. The bridge was gone. Everything appeared exactly as it had before. And yet, I could not shake the memory of the impossible approach, the headlights, the way the whistle seemed to press against the night, pressing against me. The photos offered no solace. My own senses had betrayed nothing, yet insisted on a story that logic could not hold. I never returned after dark. I don't need to. The memory is vivid enough, sharp enough to remind me of what happened. The whistle, carried in the empty siding, remains in my mind like a recording stuck on loop. Sometimes, when the wind is still and the night quiet, I can hear it faintly, as if it were carried on air rather than memory, pressing against my ears even when there is nothing to produce it. It left me with a lesson about perception and certainty, about the fragility of ordinary understanding. I know the siding is empty, I know the rails end at the river, I know that nothing should have been there. And yet, I cannot dismiss the memory, cannot ignore the weight of the impossible event that unfolded in perfect silence and precision. That night taught me that reality, at times, can produce phenomena that obey no known rules yet leave no trace. The whistle is gone now, mostly. Its echo remains in my memory, a faint, unshakable residue of fear and disbelief. I have accepted that some things cannot be explained. The siding remains abandoned, the rails still rusted, the river still black and reflective. And I have accepted that for one night, my perception of the world collided with something I cannot name, something entirely grounded in reality, yet impossible to reconcile. I learned to respect that limit, to acknowledge that the ordinary can bend into the impossible for a single, terrifying instant, and that the memory of it can last far longer than any physical evidence ever could. I decided to drive out to Pine Road that evening, partly because I needed to clear my head and partly because the curiosity had been gnawing at me for weeks. Everyone in town had some story about that stretch of road, the one that cuts through the woods past the old bridge. They said it was haunted, that people had seen things moving in the shadows, that cars sometimes stalled and strange sounds echoed through the trees. I never believed any of it. Small towns thrive on stories like that. Still, as I turned off the main road and onto the narrow, uneven asphalt of Pine Road, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, just the awareness of isolation. The further I drove, the thicker the fog rolling in from the nearby river became. Headlights barely penetrated it, and the world outside the car windows seemed to blur, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer, listening. The air smelled damp and earthy, a mix of wet leaves, river mud, and the faint, sour tang of decaying wood. The smell reminded me of early spring, when the river overflowed into the surrounding forest and the ground stayed soggy for days. I slowed as I approached the old bridge, tires crunching over loose gravel. The wood of the bridge creaked faintly under the weight of the car, though it didn't feel unsafe. I parked just before the bridge, leaving the car in low gear, and took a moment to breathe. Everything was quiet except for the faint hum of the river under the bridge and the occasional drip of water from the trees above. My eyes scanned the shadows beneath the structure. That's when I saw it. Movement too deliberate, too measured to be the wind flicking leaves. At first, I thought it was a deer. They were common around here, especially at dusk. But this didn't look like any deer I'd ever seen. Its outline was low and crouched, but the shape was wrong. The limbs seemed longer than they should be, and the head stayed unnaturally still while the rest of the body shifted slightly. I froze, flashlight in hand, training the beam directly at it. It didn't flinch. It didn't run. It just followed the light. Every step I took backward, it mirrored in its own way, shifting to keep itself partially hidden but always oriented toward me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a fallen log with a branch sticking up, moving with the wind. Maybe it was an animal I didn't recognize, wounded or curious. But the way it adjusted its position, the subtle twitch of limbs that weren't quite animal, made my stomach tighten. The forest felt denser, more oppressive, as if the fog had thickened around me alone. I backed slowly, scanning every tree line, every shadow cast by the weak flashlight. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, a rhythmic pounding that seemed far too fast for the stillness around me. Every instinct I'd screamed to leave, but I couldn't stop looking. It stayed just under the bridge, crouched low in the shadowed area. But there was an intelligence in its stillness. I realized then that it wasn't making any sound at all, which was strange. Most animals in the forest make noises when they move, even small ones. The absence of noise made it feel larger than it was, almost deliberate, as if it was studying me. The air smelled even stronger now, a mix of damp wood, river rot, and something acrid, like metal left in water too long. I forced myself not to run, not to make sudden movements, and began inching back toward the car, flashlight sweeping constantly over the shape. The bridge seemed to stretch forever in that fog. Every second of hesitation made the figure under the bridge feel closer, as though the shadows themselves had weight. I considered my options, thought about calling someone, realized my phone had barely any signal out here. The screen flickered with a weak bar, enough for emergency calls maybe, but not enough for texts or anything else. I kept my breathing shallow, careful not to make any sudden noises. The sound of my footsteps on gravel sounded deafening in the silence, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following behind me. Finally, I reached the car. My hands were damp, trembling slightly despite my effort to stay calm. I locked the doors, the click echoing like a small barricade against whatever I'd just seen. For a moment, I sat in the driver's seat, engine running, lights on, heart still hammering. I kept glancing at the bridge, half expecting the shape to move toward me now, but it stayed put. Something about it didn't feel predatory, not in a way I could name, but it was large, strange, and impossible to ignore. I backed out slowly, watching the side mirror. The bridge and the shadowy figure disappeared behind the fog as I drove down Pine Road. On the way home, the fog seemed to follow me, curling around the car, hugging the trees. I kept the windows closed, the heater running, trying to push the damp smell out of the car. Every crack of a branch or distant rustle made me flinch. I thought about how small towns tell stories, how every road or building has a memory or warning attached to it. Maybe Pine Road had simply earned its reputation because people feel alone here. Maybe it was something else entirely. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the familiar streetlights and warm smell of winter air were grounding. I parked in front of my house, sat for a moment with the engine off, and tried to convince myself that what I had seen was nothing more than a deer, a stray dog, or some quirk of shadows and fog. But the memory stayed. The shape under the bridge, crouched and following my flashlight, felt real in a way that sticks in the chest long after logic tells you it can't be. I checked the bridge the next day from a safe distance in daylight. There was nothing there. No footprints, no disturbance, nothing that could confirm what I'd seen. The river flowed normally beneath it, and the forest looked like it always did. I told myself it had been the fog, my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. And maybe it was, but I never drove out to Pine Road after dark again. Even months later, when the memory surfaced, my stomach tightened the same way, and I could feel the damp fog curling around me. I never found an explanation, but that night taught me something about fear, isolation, and how even ordinary places can feel uncomfortably alive when you're alone. It wasn't supernatural, and it didn't have to be. The reality was enough. The strange, crouched shape under the bridge, the thick fog rolling off the river, the oppressive quiet of the woods. That was all it took for a small town road to feel dangerous, for a night drive to feel like it might never end. And that, I think, is what stayed with me the most. The awareness that even in familiar places, you're never truly alone, and that sometimes the things that feel most unreal are simply ordinary things seen in a different light. I never went back, and I never will, because some experiences don't need proof. They only need to be remembered. I remember that night with a clarity that makes it feel like it's still happening. I had been driving for hours, delivering supplies to a few rural farms scattered along the outskirts of a small town in the Midwest. The roads were narrow, flanked by endless cornfields, and the fog had rolled in early, settling low against the ground. Streetlights were few and far between, and the headlights of my truck cut through the darkness in thin, trembling beams that barely reached the edges of the fields. The air was damp, carrying the smell of wet soil and the faint, sour tang of decaying corn leaves. It was well past midnight when I came around a bend. That stretch of road always felt empty, isolated, like you were the only person in the world. The corn swayed in the wind, whispering against itself, and shadows from the stalks stretched long and thin across the gravel. That's when I saw him, a man standing at the side of the road, soaked through, his clothes plastered to his body. The rain had stopped earlier, leaving a film of water over everything, but his hair and face were streaked with mud and water, his skin pale and slick under the dim glow of my headlights. His posture was rigid, almost desperate, and when he raised his arm to flag me down, something in the motion made my stomach tighten. I slowed the truck to a stop, the tires crunching on gravel and wet leaves. He moved quickly, almost too quickly, toward the open door. There was a wildness in his eyes, a frantic, unsteady glare that made my chest tighten. His hands were covered in dark mud, streaked and uneven, as if he'd been clawing through the earth or dragging something across it. I felt a hesitation I couldn't explain, a small, stubborn instinct in the pit of my stomach telling me not to stop. He spoke, though I couldn't hear the words over the sound of the wind and my own pulse. There was urgency in his motion, a frantic insistence. Before I could process anything, he darted across the road. He didn't run like someone escaping the rain. He moved in sudden bursts, zigzagging, slipping between the shadows of the corn, and then he was gone, swallowed by the dense stalks. I sat frozen for a moment, engine idling, trying to convince myself I had imagined it, that my eyes had played tricks on the wet, reflective surface of the field. I continued to the farmhouse, my hands tight on the wheel, scanning the road and the edges of the corn with a tension I couldn't shake. The family inside was asleep when I arrived, their warm kitchen and soft lighting a stark contrast to the damp, empty fields outside. I carried the supplies in quietly, my mind still running over the image of the man and his sudden disappearance. Nothing seemed out of place in the house. No footprints, no sounds, no signs that anyone had been nearby. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the man, or whatever he was, had been closer than I realized. On a sudden impulse, I went back outside, drawn by a need I couldn't name. The gravel underfoot had started to firm slightly in the chill of early November, the night quiet except for the occasional rustle of the corn and the faint drip of water from the rooftops. That's when I saw the tracks. They were faint in the mud near the edge of the field, shallow impressions that started among the stalks and led directly toward where I had parked my truck. The marks were irregular, uneven, as if whoever made them had been running or stumbling, but they stopped abruptly at the boundary where the corn met the road, just before the gravel. There was no continuation, no sign of movement into the road, nothing to suggest he had left that space after approaching my truck. I stared at those tracks for what felt like a long time. The chill of the night crept into my fingers, and I could feel my pulse in my temples. It didn't make sense. How could he have run across the road, vanished into the corn, and then left footprints that ended just short of the gravel? There was nothing in the mud to suggest he had climbed, crawled, or disappeared physically. The logic of the tracks contradicted the memory of what I'd seen. My mind churned with possibilities, someone hiding, a trick of perspective, maybe even exhaustion from a long night, but none of it felt right. I didn't sleep well that night. The image of him standing at the side of the road, drenched and wild-eyed, haunted me. I kept imagining the tracks in the mud, frozen in place, as if he had been there and then simply ceased to exist. The cornfield, normally unremarkable, became oppressive in my mind, each stalk a potential hiding place, each shadow a space for the unknown. Even days later, the scene replayed itself in fragments. The smell of wet earth, the gloss of the mud on his hands, the flash of his terrified eyes. The next morning, I drove the route back through the field slowly, scanning the edges, looking for any trace. There was nothing. The mud had dried into cracks, erasing everything. The corn swayed in the wind as if nothing had happened, perfectly ordinary and indifferent. I talked to a neighbor who lived near the bend where I had first seen him. No one had reported anyone walking along the road. No missing persons, no disturbances. The local police suggested it could have been a hitchhiker or someone lost, but there were no reports of anyone in the area that night. I never saw him again. I returned to that route many times, each time feeling the same unease, each time imagining the abrupt end of the tracks in the mud. I can't explain what I saw, and I have never found an explanation that makes sense. But I do know what I felt in that moment. Something entirely human, entirely desperate, and entirely real. I felt fear, confusion, and a sudden, unshakable awareness that the world can produce situations that defy understanding. That night taught me something about isolation and perception, about the way a small, quiet road can suddenly feel enormous and unknowable. It taught me that fear does not need an explanation, and that the human mind can recognize danger even when the danger is elusive, even when logic fails to provide answers. The man in the cornfield, the mud on his hands, the abrupt end of the tracks, they remain a fixed point in memory, unalterable and undeniable. I still drive that road occasionally, but always with heightened attention, always watching the edges, always prepared for the impossible. I keep telling myself it was someone lost, someone in trouble, but I know the truth is more unsettling, more precise. There are moments when logic and observation diverge, and that night along the cornfields of the rural Midwest was one of those moments. I delivered the supplies, I returned safely to the main roads, but I carry the memory with me, sharp and vivid, a reminder that even in small towns, even in familiar places, the world can present a reality that resists explanation and insists on being acknowledged. The tracks, frozen at the edge of the field, remain the clearest evidence of something I cannot name. They mark a boundary, a limit to understanding, and every time I think about them, I feel the same tightening in my chest, the same chill of uncertainty. I have no answers, only certainty that what I saw that night was real, that the man was real, and that the world can present moments that are inexplicable yet undeniable. That road, the field, the abrupt end of the footprints, they're fixed in my memory, a small, terrifying proof that the ordinary can become strange in an instant, and that some nights, even in broad daylight, can leave shadows that linger long after the sun has returned. I remember the night clearly, every detail etched into my mind. It was early November, the kind of night where the wind blows sharp across Lake Michigan, carrying the cold straight into your bones. The town itself was small, tucked into a curve of the shoreline, quiet and mostly asleep by 2 in the morning. My friends and I had planned a camping trip, more for the thrill of being out in the woods than for any love of nature. The real goal was exploring old, abandoned structures we'd heard about, cabins that had been left to rot decades ago, swallowed by the forest, forgotten by everyone except the occasional hiker brave enough to wander too far. We drove down the narrow roads leading out of town, headlights cutting through the mist that had settled over the fields and the edges of the forest. By the time we parked near the tree line, the fog had thickened into a low, crawling curtain. The air smelled of wet leaves and decaying wood, sharp and earthy, and every sound, an animal snapping a twig, the distant splash of water on the lake, felt louder than it had any right to be. We carried our packs, flashlights slicing narrow beams through the black, and followed a barely visible path. The woods were dense here, trees leaning in toward each other, their trunks slick with moisture, roots gnarled like the fingers of someone trying to claw out from the ground. We found it without planning to a cabin tucked between 2 massive oaks, almost invisible until you were right on top of it. There was no number, no sign, nothing to mark it as belonging to anyone. The wood was darkened with rot, shingles missing, windows cracked and clouded with decades of grime. A shiver ran down my spine, not from cold, but from something about the way it seemed to crouch against the forest floor, waiting. My friends dared me to go inside first. I told myself it was just nerves, just a thrill, and stepped up to the threshold. The door resisted at first, stiff with old paint and swelling wood. When it finally swung open, the smell hit me, dust, mold, the sharp tang of decay. My flashlight fell across the floorboards, each one warped and brittle. I could see the patterns left by water dripping through the ceiling over years, dark stains spreading across the planks. Everywhere, dust-coated surfaces in thick layers, disturbed only by occasional paw prints of some forest animal. small and faint. I took a careful step in, the boards groaning under my weight. The walls were worse. Deep scratches ran up and down in erratic patterns, gouges that looked fresh despite the age of the cabin. They were wide and jagged, as though someone had tried desperately to escape, and I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. My friends laughed nervously behind me, but the sound died quickly, swallowed by the stillness of the room. I told them to come in, but my voice sounded strange, brittle, almost swallowed by the darkness. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a low murmur, faint, almost like the wind through the cracks of the walls. But it wasn't the wind. The sound pressed in on me, urgent, almost breath-like, like someone whispering just behind the wood, desperate and low. I froze, tried to place it, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the acoustics, the way sound bends in old, hollow spaces. My friends froze too, the beam of one flashlight swinging erratically across the room. I could feel the panic rising in me, but I forced a step forward, telling myself it was curiosity, nothing more. When I turned, I realized one of them was gone. Not behind me, not outside the door, just vanished. The light that had caught their jacket was gone, leaving only the shadows, the deep dark corners of the cabin. My stomach dropped, a sharp sour twist. I called their name, my voice shaking, echoing off the walls, but there was no answer. Only that whispering persisted, low and urgent, as if the walls themselves were alive and aware of us. We ran, not slowly, not cautiously, but full speed, hearts hammering, boots crunching over wet leaves and twigs. We left everything behind. Packs, food, blankets, flashlights, everything. It didn't matter. I didn't look back, though the corner of my vision kept catching movement, shadows that seemed to flicker along with the trees. The forest felt endless, a corridor of trunks stretching toward nowhere, the fog wrapping us in a damp, choking curtain. Eventually, we broke through to the road, lungs burning, legs trembling. The headlights of my car felt like a miracle, a small, solid anchor in a night that had refused to make sense. We piled in without speaking, slammed the doors, and drove away. Not toward town, not toward any landmarks we knew well, just away. Every turn we took was frantic, desperate to put the woods behind us. We never returned. Not the next day, not the next year. That part of the forest, near the lake, became something unthinkable, a space that belonged to someone, or something else. My friend who vanished never came back. We searched, called, notified local authorities, but there was nothing. No tracks, no signs, no clue except for the echo of that whispering and the memory of those claw marks. In the weeks that followed, the image of that cabin stayed with me. I would close my eyes and see the darkness pressing in around the doorway, the way the walls seemed almost to lean toward me, alive with a quiet, patient insistence. I replayed every step in my mind, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow flickering at the edge of my vision. I could almost feel the cold brush of something watching, waiting in the angles of that room, the hollow spaces between the rotting boards. Eventually, I stopped talking about it, mostly because no one could understand. The explanation everyone wanted, wild animals, fog playing tricks, nerves, didn't match the feeling of it, the sharp, precise weight of something being gone that shouldn't have been. I could still smell the damp wood, the rot, the heavy earthiness that hung in the corners of the cabin. Every time I imagined it, I could hear that whisper, insistent and close, a sound that was not meant to be carried on air, but rather pressed directly into the skin, into the mind. It became a part of the way I look at quiet places, at abandoned buildings, at forests that seem empty. I can't drive past that stretch of road near the lake without gripping the wheel a little tighter, imagining the trees pressing in, imagining what waits between them. My friends have moved on, or tried to, but the memory lingers. We still don't know what happened to the one who disappeared. I like to tell myself it was an accident, that they wandered too far and became lost, but the truth is sharper than that, harder to swallow. There's a certainty in the memory of that night, in the scratches on the walls, in the whispering, that some things simply exist in those spaces, patient and unaccountable, and that sometimes curiosity brings you too close. I never went camping near that part of the forest again. I stick to places with paths, with other people, with signs that someone has been there recently. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I remember the cabin. I can see the doorway, dark and expectant, the floorboards groaning under my weight. I can feel the panic, sharp and immediate, and I can hear that whisper again, low and urgent, pressing against the edges of thought. And I know, without doubt, that I'll never understand what happened or why, but I understand enough to stay away forever. That night in November changed something in me. The way silence feels in empty buildings, the way shadows can become spaces of danger, the way absence can weigh heavier than presence. I carry it still, tucked into the corners of memory, and every time I close my eyes, I remember the creaking floor, the clawed walls, the whispering that belonged to no one but the cabin itself. I remember the way one of us vanished, and I know the woods near Lake Michigan hold secrets we're never meant to uncover. We learned something that night about fear, about limits, about the fragile illusion of control. We learned that curiosity has a cost, and sometimes the price is more than anyone can pay. I never returned, and I never will. The forest reclaimed the cabin. The fog rolls thick along the lake, and the trees stand, patient and knowing, waiting for anyone foolish enough to step too close again. I remember the quarry that afternoon with a clarity that has stayed with me, the kind of clarity that makes ordinary memory feel like a recording. It was early October, the air crisp with a hint of frost, and the sun was low, casting long, sharp shadows across the jagged rock faces. The quarry had been abandoned for decades, a deep cut into the earth with cliffs rising sharply around a black pool of water that looked almost like oil. The place had a reputation in town as being dangerous, but also as a canvas for graffiti left over decades. Names, dates, symbols, layers of paint built up so thickly that some sections of the walls looked like tapestries. We parked on a narrow dirt road above the quarry, the tires crunching over gravel scattered with fallen leaves. The wind carried the smell of wet stone and damp earth, sharp and clean, mixed with the faint, sour tang of algae from the pool below. We hiked down a narrow path, careful of loose rocks, my boots crunching over broken shale and dried mud. The walls loomed as we descended, the cliffs steep and fractured, forming narrow ledges that disappeared into shadows where the sun didn't reach. The pool at the bottom was unnervingly still, black and reflective, swallowing the light around it. The graffiti was impressive. Layers of names, dates, crude sketches, and symbols stretched across the rock faces. Time had weathered much of it, the paint flaking and faded, but enough remained to give the impression of generations passing through. My friend ran ahead, pointing out colors, laughing, tracing fingers over names carved into the stone, leaving streaks of paint and dirt. I lingered, moving slowly along the edge, and that's when I noticed them, footprints pressed into the damp soil near the water's edge. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but the shape didn't make sense. They were too large, at least twice the size of a human foot in length and width. The toes, or what appeared to be toes, were uneven, some longer than others, and the print itself had a strange rhythm, not a straight line, but a wobble, as though whatever made them had an unusual gait. The prints led directly toward the pool, disappearing beneath the dark water, wet soil pressed around the edges. I crouched closer, examining the shape and depth. There was no dragging or obvious disturbance, only the subtle imprint of weight, uneven and deliberate. My friend noticed me staring and laughed, suggesting they were old animal tracks, maybe a deer or raccoon, worn down and distorted by water and mud over time. I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The tracks had an almost human-like quality in their placement, the spacing between each step and the angle of each imprint, but wrong. There was an inconsistency that made my skin prickle, a subtle asymmetry that felt deliberate, purposeful, and entirely unnatural. We moved closer to the water's edge. The ground sloped steeply, the rocks slick and jagged, and every step required careful balance. I could feel the cold rising off the pool, a damp, heavy chill that clung to my clothing. My friend scrambled ahead, testing the stability of the rocks, running a finger across wet ledges. I followed more cautiously, boots sliding on loose shale, fingers brushing against rough stone to steady myself. The quarry was silent except for the occasional scrape of loose rock underfoot and the distant hum of wind through the cliffs. No birds, no insects, nothing to break the stillness. And then, without warning, a splash echoed from the pool. It was not a small disturbance, but a heavy, abrupt sound, reverberating off the cliffs and leaving ripples across the black water. My friend stopped mid-step, looking at me with the same confusion I felt. The thing was, there was no one in the water. No rock had fallen, no animal had surfaced, nothing to account for the sound. The pool's surface was smooth again within seconds, black and reflective as before. My pulse accelerated. Every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to get out of that depression carved into the earth. My friend's expression mirrored mine, eyes wide, muscles tense, hands gripping the rock face. I turned and started climbing back toward the ledge, boots slipping on loose gravel, fingers scraping against the sharp edges of stone. My friend followed, scrambling, using every ounce of energy to gain purchase on the uneven surfaces. The adrenaline made my muscles ache, my lungs burn, and yet the fear pressed me forward, overriding any thought of careful movement. We reached the top of the cliff, collapsing on the gravel, breath coming in ragged gasps. From that vantage, the quarry looked deceptively calm, the black pool reflecting the deepening twilight, the walls towering above like silent sentinels. I looked down again, half expecting to see movement, but there was nothing, only the pool and the faint remnants of footprints along the muddy edge. The prints that had disturbed me so thoroughly were now softened by the drying mud, less distinct, almost blending with the surrounding soil, yet their presence lingered in my mind like a weight. We didn't speak, didn't need to. The unspoken agreement was clear. We had seen enough, felt enough. The allure of graffiti, of exploring the abandoned quarry, had vanished under the weight of uncertainty and the sudden, inexplicable sound. We retraced our steps carefully, leaving the edge of the quarry behind, the cliffs swallowing shadows as the sun sank lower. Every rock, every tree, every patch of dirt seemed charged with memory, a subtle tension that made my skin crawl. Back on the dirt road, I stopped the truck and looked in the rearview mirror at the quarry receding in the distance. The cliffs were dark, the pool a black smudge at the bottom. I kept imagining the uneven footprints leading into the water, the sudden splash, the way the quarry seemed to hold a stillness that was heavier than silence. The wind whispered through the corn and the grass near the roadside, and the memory of the place pressed on me with a strange persistence. I told myself it was an accident, maybe a falling branch or a fish jumping, anything that could be explained rationally. But rational thought didn't erase the memory of those prints, the size, the uneven spacing, the deliberate placement toward the pool. I carried the image for days, weeks, unable to reconcile it with the natural world. The quarry remained a scar in the landscape, ordinary in appearance, yet in memory, it had weight, substance, a presence that refused to fade. Over time, I avoided that part of town, the small road leading to the abandoned quarry, the jagged cliffs, the black water. I drove past other sites of exploration, other stretches of rock and forest, without hesitation, but the memory of that place remained vivid. I would recall the sound of the splash in quiet moments, the way it seemed to come from nowhere yet made perfect sense in context, the way the footprints led in a manner that suggested a mind, a presence, and a logic entirely unlike anything I could name. Eventually, I accepted that some experiences resist explanation, that human perception sometimes captures something real yet incomprehensible. I returned to the quarry only once, months later from the top of the road, and from that distance it seemed harmless, silent, still. The graffiti remained, the cliffs sharp and jagged, the water black and reflective. I couldn't see the footprints, couldn't hear the splash, Yet the memory of both lingered, embedded in my mind as proof that the ordinary can shift into something unsettling in a matter of seconds. That day, that quarry taught me a lesson about attention and perception, about the fragility of safety in familiar environments. I left with the knowledge that even places we think we understand, even landscapes we pass every day without thought, can harbor moments that defy expectation, moments that unsettle in ways that don't rely on myth or legend, but on simple, undeniable reality. The quarry is still there, waiting, indifferent, a small, sharp reminder that sometimes human curiosity brings us face to face with something we cannot fully explain, and the only sensible response is caution, respect, and a memory that refuses to fade. I had been out in the woods before, always alone, usually in the quiet months when snow blanketed everything and the town felt far away. That morning, I woke early, my camera packed and my gear strapped into the back of my truck. The forecast had called for clear skies, cold and still, perfect for photographing deer. The forest near my town was dense but familiar, trails I'd walked 100 times, and yet winter always made it feel new. When I parked along the edge of the forest, the world was silent except for the faint whistle of wind through the trees and the crunch of snow under my boots. Each breath formed a cloud that hung in front of me before dissolving into the gray morning. I moved slowly, scanning the edges of the clearing, my lens adjusting to the white landscape. It wasn't long before I spotted them. 3 deer grazing at the far end of the clearing. They were cautious, ears flicking, tails twitching, but they didn't flee. I crouched low, careful not to make sudden movements. The snow was deep, pressing against my legs as I maneuvered for the right angle. I clicked the shutter repeatedly, losing myself in the rhythm of photographing them, adjusting the focus, watching the way the sunlight hit their fur. Hours passed without a sound beyond my own careful steps. Then something made me pause. Footprints. At first, I thought they belonged to a hiker, but the size and shape were wrong. The snow held them perfectly, and each step was far larger than a man's, elongated, with 3 distinct marks at the front, uneven, as if the creature had an irregular gait. The prints were fresh, the edges still crisp in the cold air. I crouched to examine them, feeling my stomach tighten. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. I traced them with a gloved hand, noting the way the snow had compressed unevenly beneath the weight, as if the animal, or whatever had made them, was balancing differently with each step. Curiosity overpowered caution. I followed the prints, keeping my distance from the deer, who had already disappeared into the woods. The tracks led me through dense stands of pine, over frozen underbrush, and down a shallow slope toward a narrow creek. The snow muffled every other sound, my boots sinking with each step, the occasional snapping of a twig sounding much louder than it should. I tried to make sense of it, telling myself it was probably a large bird or some strange combination of prints layered over time. But the scale didn't match anything native. The prints continued with an uneven rhythm, spacing too wide for a human stride, too deliberate for an animal I knew. I moved faster, scanning the forest around me, my eyes trying to catch movement between the trees, shadows shifting but always empty. The tracks ended abruptly at the creek, right at the bank where the ice had formed but didn't quite hold over the flowing water. There was no sign that whatever made them had crossed, and yet the snow on the opposite side was untouched. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a tightness in my chest I hadn't expected. I stepped back, my mind racing through every logical explanation. Tracks can be deceptive. Snow can shift. Wildlife can make strange marks. But the size, the shape, the gait, it didn't add up. I glanced around, and that's when I noticed the tree. Its bark, normally smooth and light, had deep claw marks running vertically, reaching higher than I could comfortably reach. They were wide, fresh, with splinters of wood jutting out, suggesting a force strong enough to scrape away bark in long, deliberate strokes. Someone, or something, had tried to climb it. My stomach tightened further. There was no noise around me, no sign of life, but the scene felt charged, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stepped closer, examining the marks, the splintered wood, the way the snow had melted slightly beneath them. It wasn't old, not by more than a few hours, maybe less. My camera hung around my neck, suddenly feeling heavy, as if it had captured more than just images of deer that day. I snapped a few quick photos, my hands shaking despite the thick gloves. The forest seemed to stretch longer than usual, shadows deepening despite the sun still high in the sky. I decided I had seen enough. The rational part of my mind told me to leave, to put the forest between me and whatever had made those prints. I retraced my steps, though I stayed alert, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The silence was oppressive, the crunch of snow under my boots unnaturally loud. By the time I reached my truck, the sun had begun to dip, the sky turning the pale orange of late afternoon. I packed quickly, careful not to disturb anything else, and started the engine. The warmth of the cab was immediate, but it didn't ease the chill in my chest. My hands were still numb, not from the cold but from tension. I drove with the windows cracked just slightly, listening to the tires crunch over packed snow and ice, trying to make sense of what I had seen. My mind cycled through every possibility. Tracks overlapped with deer, prints distorted by melting snow, someone playing a prank. But nothing fit the details I had recorded. By the time I reached the main road, it was fully dark. I didn't stop once. I didn't want to. Every moment alone on that road felt heavy, as though the forest had followed me, lingering in the edges of my vision. The headlights cut through the night, but even the familiar turns and signs seemed strange. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, imagining movement behind me that wasn't there. The town felt distant when I finally crossed its edge, the streetlights offering comfort I hadn't realized I'd craved. I didn't speak to anyone about what I'd seen. I didn't post photos online or show them to friends. They stayed locked in my camera and in my mind. The next days were difficult. I avoided the forest entirely, sticking to familiar roads and populated areas. When I tried to rationalize it, the footprints became anomalies, the tree scratches a coincidence, but the memory refused to fade. I would find myself staring at snow in my driveway, imagining three-toed prints pressing through the white, the forest silent around them, waiting. Weeks later, I revisited the photos on my camera, the images of the deer still crisp, but in the background, faintly, there were impressions I had not noticed in the moment. Shadows between trees, slight depressions in snow that weren't consistent with deer. I examined them, enhancing contrast, measuring scale, but nothing concrete came from it. Still, the unease remained, the certainty that what I had seen was real. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't imagined, it was simply something unknown, something physical that had moved through the forest where I had been alone. I never returned to that part of the woods. I stick to areas I know well, where the land is familiar and predictable. I drive carefully, even during daylight, avoiding long stretches of forested road. The town feels smaller now, tighter, as if every tree line might hide a trace of that day. I tell myself it was just a curiosity of nature, an animal unknown to me, but I know better. The tracks, the marks on the tree, the way it all ended at the creek, it was deliberate. And though I have no way to explain it, I carry the memory with me like a shadow, a reminder that there are places in the world, even close to home, where what we think we know does not apply. Some things leave evidence, but no answers, and that day in the snow, chasing deer and following footprints became one of those things. I drive past that forest whenever I can avoid it, and if I can't, I stay on the road, my eyes on the edges, heart tight, listening for sounds that might not be there, but feel like they are. That night, the drive home, I didn't stop until dawn, and even then I didn't look back. I never will. I was driving through the Midwest on a late March night, heading east on a small highway that cut through farmland and clusters of woods. My plan was to push through and make time on the road, but around midnight, fatigue hit hard. My GPS indicated a rest stop ahead, and though it felt a little out of the way, I decided to pull off. The road was almost empty, dark except for the dim beam of my headlights and the occasional reflection of road signs. When the GPS led me down a narrow side street, I realized it was pointing to something else entirely. A small motel that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Its sign flickered sporadically, letters missing, the kind of place that felt like it belonged to another era. Paint peeled from the walls, curling in strips. Windows were dark, some cracked. The parking lot was uneven, cracked asphalt littered with small stones and remnants of trash. In one corner, a vending machine leaned slightly to one side, its glass broken, products inside toppled or missing. The air smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, mixed with the cold metallic scent of night air. I slowed my truck, then parked, hesitating as I studied the building. Despite the condition, my tired mind rationalized it. Maybe I could get a room, rest for a few hours, and continue my road trip. I grabbed my bag and stepped out. The snow from earlier in March had melted enough to leave patches of ice on the asphalt. Each step toward the front door made the cold seep through my boots. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, revealing a lobby that felt stuck in the past. The linoleum floor was cracked, a few chairs scattered like someone had left them mid-motion. Dust covered every surface, but oddly, there were signs of recent activity. A half-empty coffee cup on the counter had dried rings around it. Fresh footprints in the dust led toward a staircase at the back. I followed them cautiously, scanning the dim light of flickering ceiling bulbs. Some doors along the hallways were slightly open, their hinges squeaking faintly in the breeze from a cracked window. In the corner of the lobby, near the stairs, I noticed more signs. Discarded food wrappers, slightly crumpled, not older than a day or two. The smell of processed snacks lingered faintly. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here recently, maybe still was. I stepped toward the staircase. The steps were wooden, warped with age. As I placed my foot on the first one, a sound came from above. It was subtle at first, a scrape, low and slow, deliberate. Then it repeated, dragging across the floorboards. It was heavy, and the sound carried down the staircase, vibrating against my chest. My heart started racing. I froze, listening. The scraping paused, then started again, moving slowly along the hallway above me. There was no rhythm to it, just deliberate, methodical movement. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a maintenance cart, someone moving furniture. But the building's age and neglect made that unlikely. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. I didn't need to see it to know I had no business being upstairs. My instinct screamed to leave, and I obeyed. I stepped backward, careful not to make noise, and reached the lobby. The air felt heavier with each breath, and the smell of old wood and dust seemed stronger somehow. I grabbed my bag, swung it onto my shoulder, and stepped outside. The cold hit immediately, and I felt relief mingled with tension. I got into my truck, locking the doors behind me, and started the engine. The lights flickered in the motel's windows, revealing broken panes and shadows shifting as though the building itself was breathing. I didn't linger. I pulled back onto the highway, driving without pause, keeping my eyes on the road, but constantly glancing at the rearview mirror. The town behind me disappeared quickly, replaced by stretches of empty road and dark fields. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white despite the heater pumping warmth into the cab. Hours passed. My mind replayed every detail. The scattered chairs, the food wrappers, the footprints leading upstairs, the scraping sound that had felt impossibly deliberate. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably a transient, someone hiding out, or a local scavenger. That explanation brought some relief, though not entirely. The uncertainty, the unpredictability of whoever, or whatever, had been in that motel made my nerves taut. I didn't stop until dawn. Streetlights began appearing along the highway as the sky lightened to gray. I passed familiar exits and towns, letting the normalcy of signage and traffic slow my pulse. By the time I reached a small diner in a town I knew well, I pulled into the lot, parking away from the entrance. I stayed in the truck for a long time, letting the warmth settle into my muscles and the morning sun ease the tension. I didn't tell anyone about the motel. I didn't show photos or make posts online. There was nothing to prove, and I knew that if I spoke of it, people would chalk it up to exhaustion or imagination. Weeks later, I drove past the area again during the day. The motel was still there, more clearly derelict under sunlight, windows dark, paint curling. I couldn't see anyone inside, and the scraping sound that had haunted me was gone. The building seemed inert, almost peaceful in the clarity of daylight. Yet, I couldn't shake the memory, the sense of deliberate movement above me, of recent presence that had no explanation. I realized that the motel wasn't haunted in the supernatural sense. It was something else entirely. Abandoned places attract people who don't belong, people who move quietly, deliberately, leaving traces that can unsettle anyone who stumbles into them. I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the memories of that night stuck with me not because of fear of ghosts or monsters, but because the evidence was real, tangible, and unnerving. Now, when I travel at night, I check every exit carefully, avoiding small, unknown motels or rest stops that feel off. I stick to well-lit highways and populated areas. The night of that drive remains vivid. The cold air, the broken vending machine, the sound above the lobby floor, the shadows moving behind cracked windows. It reminded me that some risks are entirely human, mundane, yet terrifying in their unpredictability. That night shaped the way I travel, the way I notice details, the way I trust my instincts. It ended with me safe on the highway, hours from the motel, yet the memory has stayed with me, as real and grounded as the road itself. A lesson learned without needing explanation, without needing anyone else to believe it.